The Voreth Imperium did not discover humanity by accident. They found the signals first, faint, chaotic bursts of electromagnetic noise bleeding out from a small blue planet at the edge of an unremarkable star system, radio waves, television broadcasts, military radar, pings bouncing off the ionosphere and leaking into deep space like a lighthouse nobody thought to dim to any civilization advanced enough to be listening. It was the cosmic equivalent of a child shouting in a dark forest. The Voreth were always listening. Supreme Warlord Keen stood at the center of the Imperial War Chamber on the throne world of Voreth Prime, surrounded by a holographic map of 47 conquered star systems, each glowing point of light represented a civilization that had once believed itself safe. None of them had been. He was 7 feet tall, gray-skinned with 4 arms built for war and eyes the color of burning copper. He had personally overseen the subjugation of 11 worlds. He was considered by his own people to be the most dangerous living being in the known galaxy. He looked at the scan data from the Sol system and felt nothing but mild curiosity. One inhabited world, his chief analyst reported, pulling up the 3rd planet on the chamber's central display. Predominantly water, single sapient species, biological classification. Fragile, technological classification. Primitive, no evidence of faster than light capability, no orbital weapons. Platforms detected, population estimated at 8 billion individual units. 8 billion, Catherine had pacified worlds with twice that number. The math was straightforward. Atmospheric composition, he asked. Breathable but barely optimal. The species appears adapted to it, they call the planet. The analyst paused, checking the translation matrix. Earth. Someone in the chamber almost laughed. Almost. There was one voice that did not share in the room's casual confidence. Lazison Aura sat near the back of the chamber, a junior strategic analyst. 3 years into her posting and already quietly exhausted by the Imperium's institutional arrogance. She was small by Voreth standards, sharp-eyed, and she had a habit of looking at data longer than anyone else in the room. Thought was necessary, while the other analysts glanced at the Earth file and moved on or read every page 3 times. The electromagnetic readings around the planet were not what bothered her. It was the pattern of them, the sheer density, signals layered on top of signals, frequencies intersecting and overlapping in ways that suggested not chaos but infrastructure, an incomprehensibly complex web of communication and coordination, blanketing the entire planet and extending outward into the surrounding space. She had studied 46 conquered civilizations in her career. None of them had looked like this. She raised her hand. Warlord, I'd like to flag some anomalies in the sensor data before we proceed. Catherine looked at her the way a mountain looks at rain. File a report. Liaison. The electromagnetic density readings suggest. File a report. She filed the report. It was logged, categorized, and placed in a review queue that stretched 18 months into the future. The Edict of Conquest was signed that same afternoon. 4,000 warships, the largest armada the Imperium had assembled in 3 centuries, were ordered to mobilize. Supply lines were calculated. Pacification protocols were drafted. The human species was assigned a new designation in the Imperial Registry. Acquisition target 7,882. Estimated subjugation time 12 rotations. Nobody contacted Earth, the Voreth did. Not negotiate with primitives. Armada departed Voreth Prime to the thunder of war drums and the cheering of 100 million citizens lining the orbital platforms to watch. It was a glorious sight. 4,000 ships catching the light of their sun as they accelerated out of the system in perfect formation. Banners streaming in the solar wind, the greatest instrument of conquest the galaxy had ever seen. Kieran watched from the bridge of his flagship, the Eternal Dominion, with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had done this many times before and expected nothing different. Somewhere in the crowd on the orbital platforms, a child pointed at the departing fleet and asked her mother where they were going. To add another star to the Empire, her mother said proudly. On the other side of the galaxy, on a pale blue dot that the Armada's navigation charts dismissed as a minor strategic objective, a satellite array that humanity had been quietly building for 61 years, detected the FTL signature of 4,000 ships leaving Voreth Prime in a facility 3 kilometers beneath the Swiss Alps. An alarm that had never gone off before went off for the first time. A general picked up a phone. 17 governments answered before the second ring. The Voreth sent the drone 6 months ahead of the Armada. This was standard Imperial doctrine: saturate the target system with cloaked reconnaissance units, map defensive positions, catalog military assets, and return with a complete tactical picture before the first warship entered engagement range. It had worked on 46 worlds. The drones were the best stealth technology the Imperium possessed, coated in materials that absorbed every known form of active sensor radiation, running silent on minimal power, drifting through the void like ghosts. All 60 drones entered the Sol system on schedule. None came back. The first explanation offered by the Imperial Fleet Command was equipment failure. Deep space was harsh, micro impacts, radiation degradation, navigational drift, any number of mundane factors could account for signal loss. It was unfortunate but not alarming. The Armada carried its own sensor arrays. They would map the system upon arrival. Liason Aura did not believe in coincidence. She spent 3 days submitting requests for access to the raw telemetry data from the drone's last transmissions. Her requests were declined twice and ignored. Once before a clerk in the data archive, apparently bored, accidentally granted her access to the final 0.8 seconds of signal from all 60 units. It was not much, but it was enough. The drones had not failed. Their systems had been functioning perfectly right up until the moment they stopped. No system errors, no navigational anomalies, no gradual signal degradation that would suggest physical damage or radiation interference. The signals simply ended cleanly simultaneously across multiple drones that were operating in different sectors of the outer system, thousands of kilometers apart. Clean termination simultaneous across units that should have had no knowledge of each other's positions or sat with that data for a long time. Whatever had neutralized the drones had not stumbled across them. It had known exactly where they were, tracked all 60 of them independently across an enormous volume of space, and eliminated them at a moment of its choosing, not out of Panic not with any visible alarm. Response but with the calm efficiency of someone swatting flies they had been watching for a while before deciding they were annoying enough to deal with. She wrote a second report, longer this time more detailed. She included a statistical analysis of the probability that 60 simultaneous mechanical failures could occur in drones with no shared components or approximate positions. Number was so small it was effectively zero. She included her interpretation of what the termination pattern implied about the sophistication of the detecting system. She included a recommendation, formal, carefully worded, professionally restrained, that the mission be paused pending further analysis. The report was filed. A supervisor stamped it, reviewed. There was no evidence anyone had read a single word. Meanwhile, on Earth, the data from the drone intercepts had been cataloged, analyzed, and distributed to a joint command that most of the planet's population did not know existed. The drone stealth coding was impressive. Genuinely impressive, Aura would have admitted if she'd known, but 60 years of specifically preparing for this moment had advantages that no amount of technology could easily overcome. Humanity had not built their detection network to find things they expected. They had built it to find things they didn't know to expect. The drone's drive signatures, faint as whispers, had been detected crossing Neptune's orbit. From that point, the tracking was routine. In a command center that occupied the entirety of a hollowed mountain in northern Canada, a woman named Admiral C.O. Park stood before a display showing the Armada's projected trajectory and spoke to a room of 200 analysts and officers with the unhurried authority of someone who had been rehearsing this moment for 23 years of her career. They took the bait on the drones, she said. They'll assume they failed. They won't adjust their approach vector. She turned to her tactical director. How long until they reach the hammer line? 6 months, Admiral, give or take 3 days. Park nodded slowly, studying the map. 4,000 ships. She had war-gamed this exact scenario 812 times over the course of her career. Her predecessors had warmed it before her. The Voreth formation. She recognized it immediately from the drive signature geometry. The hammer, aggressive, front-loaded, designed for rapid, overwhelming force against a static defensive position. It assumed the target was going to stand still and absorb the blow. Begin final positioning on the belt assets, she said quietly. No active emissions, and somebody get me the exact specifications on their flagship class. I want to know which component fails first when we hit it. An analyst across the room pulled up a file that had been compiled from 60 years of intercepted Vorath transmissions. The flagship specifications were already there, had been for 11 years. The Armada dropped out of FTL at the edge of the Sol system on a Tuesday. Nobody on Earth panicked. That was the thing that would later unsettle the Vorath historians more than anything else about that day. Not the weapons, not the tactics, not even the outcome, but the fact that 8 billion human beings went about their morning routines with the full knowledge that 4,000 alien warships had just materialized beyond Neptune, and the overwhelming collective response was something close to grim. Focus, calm. Schools stayed open. Trains ran on time. In a bakery in Lyon, a woman named Sist pulled fresh bread from the oven at 6:00 a.m. and listened to the emergency broadcast on her radio, the one that had been set up years ago, to inform the public if this day ever came and felt something that was not quite fear and not quite excitement, but existed in the narrow, serious space between them. She turned to her assistant and said, "So it's today." Then her assistant nodded. They kept working. What else was there to do? The people who had spent their entire careers preparing for this moment were already at their posts. The bread still needed to come out of the oven. On the bridge of the Eternal Dominion, Warlord Kane surveyed his fleet array in the hammer formation and felt the deep, resonant satisfaction of absolute power. 47 systems, 46 conquered worlds, and now a 47th, a small blue marble hanging in the black, utterly unaware of what was coming. He opened a broad spectrum transmission toward Earth. His translator spoke in 17 of the planet's dominant languages simultaneously, a gesture of magnanimous condescension that the Imperium used on every target. World, people of Earth, you have been designated acquisition target 7882 by the Eternal Voreth Imperium. Resistance is not advised. Surrender all governing bodies within one standard rotation. Compliance will be rewarded with integration into the Empire's labor structure. Non-compliance will result in total pacification. This message will not be repeated. He cut the transmission and waited. The response was silence, not panic. Silence, not the frantic, desperate silence of a civilization scrambling to respond. Deliberate silence, the kind that has a shape to it. Await, the kind that belongs to someone who heard you perfectly well and decided your words were not worth answering. Catherine found this mildly irritating. Advance the fleet, he ordered. Standard approach. They'll respond when they can see us properly. The Armada began its slow, magnificent advance through the outer system. 4,000 ships, each one larger than anything humanity had ever put in orbit. Their hulls caught the distant light of Sol and glittered like a moving field of stars. It was objectively one of the most terrifying sights in the known galaxy. As the fleet crossed the orbit of Neptune, every passive sensor array on every ship registered something that the duty officers initially dismissed as an instrument ghost. They were being watched, not scanned. There were no active sensor emissions bouncing off their holes, nothing they could lock onto and trace back to a source, just a quality to the space around them, a sense that every movement of the fleet was being observed and recorded with absolute precision. Several sensor operators filed anomaly reports. Several supervisors marked them as instrument calibration issues. The fleet continued its advance. On the bridge of the Eternal Dominion, Lise and Aura stood at her station and watched the passive sensor readouts with her hands very still at her sides. She had been assigned to the flagship as a formality, a junior analyst attached to the command staff to compile post-conquest cultural assessments. She was not supposed to be monitoring tactical systems. She monitored them anyway. The passive sensor ghost was not an instrument error. She had seen the pattern before. In the drone telemetry, the same quality, the same sourceless, complete, unhurried awareness. Whatever was watching the fleet had been watching it since Neptune, probably longer. She looked at the blue planet growing slowly. On the main viewport, it looked so small, so quiet, so perfectly, deliberately unbothered. Aura felt the first cold thread of Genuine fear moved through her. Not fear of the planet, not fear of humans, but the specific fear of someone who has just realized with total clarity that they are not the one in control of the situation they thought they were controlling. She pulled up the drone telemetry one more time on her personal console and stared at it. Clean. Termination, simultaneous calm. Oh, she said very quietly to nobody. The Armada crossed the orbit of Jupiter at 400 hours UTC on a Wednesday morning. The transmission arrived at 40:01. It did not come through any external channel. It did not knock on the door of the fleet's communications array or bounce off any antenna or register as an incoming signal on any detection system. It simply appeared fully formed, crystal clear, embedded directly inside each ship's closed internal network, as if every encryption protocol and firewall the Voreth had ever built did not exist, not as a broadcast, not as a signal to be intercepted and decoded, as a message that was already inside, waiting to be read like a letter someone had placed on your pillow while you slept. Every ship in the fleet received it simultaneously. Every screen on every bridge displayed the same thing. The voice that spoke was calm, not theatrical calm, not the performed calm of someone trying to project strength, the genuine calm of a person who has had 63 years to think about exactly what they want to say and has decided on the simplest version. It spoke in High Voreth, not translated Voreth, not approximated Voreth. Perfect, flawless, formally correct. High Voreth, the ancient administrative language of the imperial court, the language of edicts and treaties, the language that said, we know exactly who you are and we know exactly how to speak to you. This is the United Earth Defense Coordination transmitting on behalf of the human species. We are addressing the command staff of the Voreth Imperial Armada currently crossing the Jovian threshold. We will say 3 things. We ask that you listen carefully, as this transmission will not be repeated. First, we are fully aware of the political, military, and strategic structure of the Voreth Imperium. We have 43 years of intercepted communications, 17 years of decoded imperial records, and complete technical schematics for every ship class currently present in this fleet. Second, we have been aware of your civilization's existence for 63 years. We chose not to make contact during that time. That was a deliberate decision. Third, the Armada now crossing the Jovian threshold has approximately 4 minutes to reverse course before the engagement window closes. We are not issuing this as a threat. We are issuing it as accurate information. What you choose to do with accurate information is entirely up to you. We sincerely hope you make the right choice. We have no desire to destroy your fleet. We have no desire for war, but we are fully prepared for both and have been for some time. The voice paused. You have 4 minutes. We will not contact you again before the window closes. The bridge of the Eternal Dominion was absolutely silent. Kieran stared at the display for 10 full seconds. Around him, officers exchanged glances, not the cocky glances of warriors expecting easy victory, but something smaller and less certain. Collective flinch. Nobody wanted to be the first to acknowledge 43 years of intercepted communications, complete technical schematics, 63 years of knowing. Lisa and Ara's hands were trembling. She pressed them flat against her console to make them stop. Her mind was racing through the implications with the unstoppable momentum of someone watching a wall collapse in slow motion. They knew the Vorath existed, they said. Nothing. They built and prepared and waited in silence for 6 decades. They decoded High Vorath. They breached closed military network as if it were an open door, and they delivered all of this in a message so precisely timed and so surgically inserted that it demonstrated without a single weapon being fired that the Vorath had no secrets from them. This was not a primitive civilization caught off guard. This was a civilization that had spent 63 years specifically preparing to deal with the Vorath. Warlord, she said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt. I strongly recommend. Keen turned from the display. His expression had moved through surprise, through uncertainty, and had arrived somewhere harder and colder. He was the supreme warlord of a civilization that had never retreated. He had won 46 worlds. He was not going to turn his armada around because of a recorded message, no matter how well crafted. Accelerate to attack speed, he said. He said it loudly. He said it with authority. He said it the way he had said it 46 times before in front of 46 worlds that had subsequently fallen. 3 minutes and 50 seconds remained, then 3 minutes, then 2. Nobody on the bridge spoke, nobody moved except to follow orders, fingers on consoles, eyes on screens, every single one of them feeling something they did not have the vocabulary to properly name. The clock hit 0. Nothing happened for exactly 11 seconds. Nothing happened, and Keitharin allowed himself to believe that it had been a bluff, an elaborate, technically impressive, linguistically perfect bluff, but a bluff nonetheless. He opened his mouth to order the targeting arrays to begin their lock sequencer. Then every propulsion system in the fleet cut out at once. It was not an explosion, it was not a battle. There was no fire. It began with a pulse. Human engineers who had designed it called it the lattice, a network of 17,000 satellites distributed throughout the inner and outer solar system, each one appearing to any external observer to be exactly what its public registry claimed, whether observation units, communications relay, deep space, research arrays, or survey platforms attached to asteroid mining operations. They had been launched over the course of 40 years. They had been positioned by mathematicians who spent entire careers calculating the precise orbital parameters needed for the moment the lattice would be asked to do what it was actually built for. When Admiral Park said now the lattice fired, it was not a weapon in the way the Vorath understood weapons. It did not burn, it did not explode. It was a precisely coordinated pulse of directed electromagnetic disruption delivered simultaneously from 17,000 points in a spherical pattern that enveloped the entire fleet, calibrated to the exact frequency ranges of Vorath propulsion drive cores based on 43 years of intercepted engineering specifications. The pulse lasted 0.3 seconds. Every ship above cruiser class in the Armada lost propulsion simultaneously. Not power propulsion. Life support stayed on, lights stayed on, internal systems stayed on. The crews were unharmed. The ship simply stopped moving. 4,000 warships hanging in space, with their engines dead, their drive cores fused at a molecular level that could not be repaired without dry dock facilities floating like enormous, helpless monuments to the gap between what the Vorath thought they knew and what was actually true aboard the Eternal Dominion. The silence that followed the propulsion failure was a different kind of silence than the one that followed the transmission. That silence had been uncertain. This silence was the silence of people who have just watched something impossible happen and have not yet caught up to what it means. Drive status, Catherine said. His voice was controlled. All drives offline. Warlord across the entire fleet simultaneously. Weapons. Online targeting arrays responding. It was at that moment with weapons online and nothing to shoot at that the second phase began. The mass drivers had been built along the asteroid belt over a period of 22 years under the publicly registered designation of the Trans Belt or propulsion network. They were real or propulsion systems. They had moved real ore for real mining operations for 2 decades. They had also in their spare time been used to practice firing patterns that had nothing to do with or the projectiles were not large. They did not need to be accelerated to 0.04% of the speed of light by electromagnetic rails stretching 40 km through the asteroid rock. A tungsten rod the size of a human forearm carried enough kinetic energy to be relevant even to a Vorath warship's armor, and they did not fire one. They fired thousands from 47 separate positions along the belt in a precisely orchestrated pattern that had been calculated by a targeting A that had spent 11 years doing nothing but refining this specific attack. Projectiles did not target hulls. They targeted components, weapons arrays, FTL drive housings, sensor nodes, external communications, antennae. The targeting data was derived from the complete technical schematics humanity had spent 43 years compiling from intercepted Vorath engineering transmissions. Every ship in the fleet had its specific vulnerabilities mapped. The projectiles hit exactly what they were aimed at from 17 vectors simultaneously with an accuracy that no Vor gunnery officer had ever achieved in training, let alone in combat. Aboard the Eternal Dominion, weapons went offline 11 seconds after the drives had, then the FTL drives, then external communications. The impacts were not catastrophic. No hull breaches, no explosions, no structural failures, just precise, deliberate destruction of every system that made the warships dangerous or mobile. 4 minutes and 11 seconds after the engagement window closed, the Armada ceased to exist as a military force. 4,000 ships, 4,000 intact, powered, life-supported vessels drifting in a spreading debris field of their own. Destroyed weapon systems, completely helpless, their crews alive and unheard, floating in the gravity well of a planet they had come to conquer. Not a single human weapon had been fired from a platform they could see. Not a single human pilot had been put at risk. No human ship had left Earth's orbit. On the bridge of the Eternal Dominion, Catherine stood at the viewport and looked at his fleet. He did not speak. For a very long time, Lisa Aura looked at her console. Her hands had stopped trembling. She felt very strangely something almost like relief. The specific relief of someone who has been screaming a warning into the void for months and has been proven catastrophically right and is too exhausted to feel anything as simple as satisfaction. She pulled up the engagement data and began to read it. She wanted to understand exactly what had happened. She suspected she was going to be the one who had to explain it to the Eternal Throne, and she intended to explain it completely. Emergency lighting turned the bridge of the Eternal Dominion the color of dried blood. Nobody moved, nobody spoke. The 43 officers and crew members on the command deck were frozen in their positions, processing the reality that the most powerful military fleet in the known galaxy was drifting in space like a scattering of broken toys, and that they had not managed to fire a single shot in response. Catherine stood at the viewport for 11 minutes before he turned around. In 40 years of military service across 46 conquered worlds, he had never been defeated. He had never faced a situation he did not control. He had walked into civilizations that had begged, and civilizations that had fought, and civilizations that had tried everything in between, and the outcome had always been the same because the outcome had always been determined before the Armada arrived. That was the nature of the Vorath Imperium. Overwhelming force deployed against everything that was not overwhelming force. It was not subtle. It did not need to be. He turned and looked at his officers. Several of them looked away. A few were still frantically running diagnostic checks on systems they must have known were not coming back online, because doing something, anything, was better than standing still and accepting the shape of what had happened. Leeson Aura was the only one looking directly at him. He had dismissed her reports twice. He had not read them once. She did not say it. He could see it in her expression, the precise professional restraint of someone choosing not to say the thing they had every right to say. In some ways that was worse. Status report, he said. His tactical officer, a decorated veteran of 6 campaigns, recited the numbers in a voice stripped of everything except the facts, because the facts were the only thing in the room that were not humiliating. All drives disabled, all FTL systems destroyed, weapons arrays disabled, external communications partially destroyed, life support fully operational, crew status across the fleet, no fatalities, minor injuries from impact, tremors, medical teams responding, no fatalities. Kieran absorbed that detail and turned it over in his mind. The humans had neutralized 4,000 warships with 0 crew casualties, not because they couldn't have caused casualties, because they chose not to. That was not mercy. Exactly. Mercy implied a decision made in the heat of action. This was something more calculated, and in its own way more disturbing. It was a message delivered in the grammar of warfare. We can do this precisely enough to remove your capability without removing your life. We chose that level of precision on purpose. We want you to go home and explain what you saw. The second transmission arrived while he was still processing this. The same voice, the same flawless high Vorath, just as calm as before, perhaps even more so. The calm of something concluded rather than something pending. This is the United Earth Defense Coordination. We are currently tracking the status of all 4,000 vessels in your fleet. We can see that your crew members are unharmed and your life support systems are operating normally. We will be sending boarding craft to each disabled vessel within the next 3 hours. Our teams carry food, water, and medical Supplies, they are not armed with lethal weapons. Please do not resist them. Their only purpose is to ensure your people are comfortable for the transit home. Your faster than light drives have been disabled rather than destroyed. The drive cores can be restored to function with approximately 90 hours of repair work under normal conditions. Replacement components for the specific failure points will be provided. We have prepared packages for each vessel class in your fleet. Additionally, we transmitted a full technical report of this engagement to the Eternal Throne 4 minutes ago. They have been informed of the outcome and of our diplomatic proposal. We have also included recommended dates for a first contact summit along with the location of a neutral meeting point of our choosing. We look forward to beginning that conversation. We hope you will convey our sincerity to your leadership. The transmission ended. Catherine did not move for a long time. Then slowly he sat down in the command chair, not with the practiced authority of a warlord taking his position, but with the quiet deflation of a man absorbing something too large to stand. Through his 4 hands rested on the armrests. He stared at the middle distance. They had already transmitted the report to the throne before the engagement was even finished, because they knew exactly how long the engagement was going to take and planned accordingly. They had the replacement parts ready for every ship class, organized, labeled, prepared, waiting. They had transmitted a diplomatic proposal with meeting dates scheduled in advance. Aura pulled up the engagement data on her console and read it in silence. The lattice network, the mass drivers, the intercept timeline, the targeting precision, the 63 years. She read it slowly and carefully, building the full picture in her mind, the way she always did, not looking for the dramatic moment, but for the architecture underneath it, the structure of decisions that had led here. A civilization had looked out at the galaxy, found something dangerous approaching, said nothing publicly, and then spent 63 years building a response so precise, so complete, so carefully controlled that when the moment finally came, they were not defending themselves. They were administering a lesson. They had managed the entire situation, the probes, the approach, the engagement, the aftermath, with the unhurried competence of people executing a plan they had had time to make perfect. From the moment the Voreth had signed the Edict of Conquest, the humans knew it was coming. From the moment the Armada departed, the humans had been in control, not reacting to the Voreth, managing them. Aura set down her console. She looked out the viewport at the blue planet below, small and still and utterly unbothered, going about its Wednesday with its trains running on time and its bread coming out of the oven. Warlord, she said quietly. He looked at her. I'll begin preparing the report for the Eternal Throne. He nodded. There was nothing else to say. The boarding teams arrived exactly when they said they would. They came in small craft, unarmed, marked with a blue and white symbol that the translation matrix identified as an ancient human emblem associated with cooperation between nations. They docked with practiced efficiency, cycling through airlocks with the calm competence of people who had rehearsed the procedure. They brought food in sealed containers, water in standardized portable units, and medical personnel carrying equipment that upon inspection was more advanced than anything in the Eternal Dominions medical bay. They were shorter than Vorath, softer looking in the physical sense, bipedal, two-armed relatively. Fragile in their construction, several Vorath crew members who had been anticipating something more physically imposing visibly recalibrated their expressions when the humans came aboard. The team leader assigned to the flagship introduced herself as Lieutenant Commander Yara Asai. She was medium height, dark-skinned, calm and carrying a personal translation unit that spoke flawless mid-Vorath, the everyday dialect, not the formal high Vorath of the transmission. She looked around the bridge with the quiet professional assessment of someone cataloging a situation, and then she smiled, not a performance of warmth, but the genuine small smile of a person who has arrived somewhere they expected to be. We understand this is a difficult moment, she said. We're not here to make it worse. Is there anything your crew needs immediately? Catherine stared at her for a long time. You knew, he said. You knew the entire time? Yes, she said simply without apology. 63 years. He wanted to ask why. Why not contact us? Why not negotiate? Why not reveal yourselves? He found he could not form the questions in a way that didn't already contain their own answers. Because we weren't ready. Because we needed to understand you first. Because 63 years of watching taught us that the Vorath do not negotiate with civilizations they consider primitive, and we needed to not be primitive by the time you came. He did not ask, she did not elaborate. 3 days later, in a facility carved into the rock beneath the Atacama Desert, in South America, a woman named Dr. Layla Safi was assigned to give the Vorath command staff something that had been prepared in various draft forms for 31 years, a full historical briefing on humanity's 63-year awareness and preparation program. The room she used was called informally the museum. It had never been shown to anyone outside the program. It had been built with the specific intention of being shown to exactly this audience at exactly this moment. Its walls were covered in timelines, technical diagrams, intercepted communications transcripts, weapons development histories, and something the Vorath did not initially understand, the personal records of the people who had done the work, not the generals and the admirals and the heads of state, the linguists who had spent careers decoding a language they could never publicly admit to knowing, the engineers who had designed satellite systems with hidden secondary payloads, the mathematicians who had calculated mass driver trajectories for a target they spent decades hoping would never actually come, the intelligence analysts who had read 43 years of Vorath transmissions and compiled everything they found into files that sat in encrypted archives, waiting for a day like this one. Dr. Safi walked the Vorath officers through it chronologically. The first detection of Vorath FTL signatures 63 years ago from an observatory in Chile that had been built specifically to look for exactly this kind of signal, funded by a black budget project that predated the current generation of political leadership by 2 administrations. The signal had been weak, fragmentary, and unmistakable to people who knew what they were looking for. The formation of the United Earth Defense Coordination 61 years ago in a meeting that involved representatives from every nation on the planet within operational space program. The meeting lasted 9 days. The agreement that came out of it had never been leaked, not once, not in 61 years of existence across 17 changes of government in the major member nations through economic crises, political upheavals in the full, extraordinary turbulence of human civilization going about its business. 12,000 people over 6 decades had known. The program existed at various levels of classification. Not one of them had broken. Kieran standing in front of a wall of faces, engineers, analysts, linguists, soldiers, diplomats, scientists, felt something he had no precise word for. The Voreth Imperium had assumed that humanity's greatest weakness was its fragmentation. 8 billion individuals, hundreds of languages, dozens of competing governments, constant internal conflict, visible in every broadcast signal. Leaking from the planet, it looked like chaos. It looked like a species that couldn't possibly coordinate at the scale needed to matter. They had all been looking at the noise and missing the signal. The signal was this: when humanity agreed something mattered enough, they kept the secret. They did the work. They didn't announce it. They didn't argue about credit. They built the thing generation after generation, and they waited. Dr. Safi stopped at a particular display near the end of the timeline. Photograph old, faded, at the edges of a group of people in a windowless room, sitting around a table covered in papers and early computer equipment. The timestamp in the corner read 61 years ago. This is the founding meeting, she said. These are the people who decided 61 years ago that if a fleet came to this solar system, it would not find us unprepared. She paused. Most of them are dead now. They never knew if the fleet was actually coming. They never knew if any of it would be needed. They built it anyway. The room was very quiet. Leeson Aura was standing near the back. She had been assigned to attend the briefing and compile notes for her report to the throne. She had been writing continuously since it began. Now her stylus was still. She was looking at the photograph. She was thinking about the report she had filed twice and had seen dismissed twice without being read, and about what it said about the Voreth, that a junior analyst warning had been invisible to an institution that had never been wrong before. And she was thinking about what it said about the humans, that they had looked at the same galaxy. The Voreth looked at the same predatory, conquest-driven reality and had responded not with denial, not with panic, but with 63 years of patient, disciplined, secret preparation. Dr. Safi turned from the photograph and looked at her audience. We didn't want to fight you, she said. We spent 63 years trying to make sure we wouldn't have to. What happened 4 days ago was the result we were hoping for, that you would survive the engagement, that nobody would die, and that we'd be standing in this room. She gestured at the walls around them. All of this exists so you can take it home, so your people can understand exactly what happened and why. We don't want an empire. We don't want your systems. We want what we've always wanted, which is to be left alone. And if you're interested to talk. Catherine looked at the photograph for a long time. 61 years, people who died without knowing if their work would ever matter. He had conquered 46 worlds. He had never not once been humbled. He was humbled now. The journey home took 42 days. Voreth engineers, working with the replacement components the humans had provided, neatly packaged, precisely labeled, accompanied by installation guides written in technical Voreth, restored FTL capability to the Armada ships in rotating shifts over the first 3 days. the humans who had come aboard, as support staff remained for the duration, eating in the mess halls, learning names, answering questions with the same unhurried directness they seem to apply to everything. Several VOR crew members during those 42 days found themselves having conversations they had not expected to have about families, about the stars, about what the other species had found. Out there in the dark, one young Voreth weapons officer spent an entire evening teaching Lieutenant Commander O a card game from the southern provinces of Voreth Prime. She beat him 4 times in a row. Catherine wrote his report alone in his quarters with the door sealed. He wrote every word of it himself. He did not ask a subordinate to draft it. He did not soften the language or suggest alternative interpretations of events or find the framing that would minimize the scale of what had happened. He had spent 40 years in the service of the Eternal Throne, and he had in that time sent many reports describing victories. He owed the throne the same honesty about a defeat, especially if the defeat was his own. He wrote it in chronological order. Edict, the probes, the transmission, the engagement, 4 minutes and 11 seconds. The museum, the photograph. He described the humans' preparation with complete accuracy. He described the precision of their weapons. He described the replacement parts, the medical teams, the card game. He described Dr. Saifa standing in front of 61 years of human work and saying, "We don't want an empire." He wrote one additional section outside the formal structure of the report that he marked personal and discretionary, but did not remove. In it he wrote about Liason Aura's reports, the ones he had dismissed without reading. He named them, specifically referenced their filing dates, described their contents from memory. He wrote that they had been correct, that he had been wrong to dismiss them, and that the Imperium's institutional habit of overconfidence had been visible in his own decisions on the command bridge and had contributed materially to the outcome. He wrote it not as self-flagellation, but as information, because information was what the throne needed, and he had spent enough of his career managing the impression of the Voreth Imperium's invincibility to know that the impression had just become its own strategic liability. He submitted the report unedited. The Armada arrived at Voreth Prime on a morning that would later be entered into the Imperial calendar as the day of reckoning, not as a defeat officially, but as a reckoning because the Imperial chroniclers had enough linguistic flexibility to choose the word that carried the right weight without the wrong connotations. The High Council convened in full within hours of the fleet's arrival, all 71 members. The last time all 71 had been in the same room together was 40 years ago for the formal celebration of the Imperium's 46th conquest. Catherine stood before them and delivered his report verbally, standing at the center of the chamber with no notes because he had written it enough times in his head during the 42-day journey that it had become a permanent fixture of his memory. He spoke for 3 hours. The council did not interrupt once. When he finished, the silence lasted 4 minutes and 31 seconds, longer than the engagement itself. The council spoke among themselves for 3 days, not in formal session, in the corridors, in private offices, in small groups that formed and reformed around the question that everyone was circling. But nobody wanted to be the first to say plainly, The Imperium had encountered something it could not conquer, not because humanity was more brutal, not because they had more ships, not because they were more aggressive or more expansionist or more willing to burn a world to ash, but because they were more patient, more coordinated, more disciplined, and more quietly, precisely capable than the Voreth had imagined any civilization could be without advertising itself. What did that mean? For an empire built on the premise that conquest was inevitable. On the fourth day, the council voted. The diplomatic proposal from Earth had specified a neutral meeting point, a location in the void between star systems equidistant from Sol and Voreth Prime at coordinates that humanity had calculated and transmitted with the quiet confidence of a species that had been doing the math longer than anyone knew. The vote was 68-3 in favor of sending an envoy. Leeson Aurora was assigned as the Voreth representative. There was some discussion about whether this was appropriate. She was junior. She had filed dissenting reports that had been ignored. She was not from the traditional diplomatic caste. The discussion did not last long. Kieran, who was present at the council session in an advisory capacity, said 6 words. She was right when we were wrong. The debate ended. Aura accepted the assignment without ceremony. She spent 2 days preparing, reviewing the full contents of the museum briefing that she had already largely memorized, and composing her own notes on what she wanted to understand from the humans. When she finally had the opportunity to simply ask, she had questions that had been accumulating for months. The human station occupied a point in empty space that looked from the outside deceptively modest, a rotating ring structure, clean-lined and functional, lit warmly. From within, no weapons visible, no military escort, a single beacon transmitting docking instructions in high Voreth with a warmth that managed to come through even in the formal register or shuttle docked without incident. Airlock cycled. The human official who met her was a woman named Ambassador Danny Ray's, tall, gray-haired, with the unhurried manner of someone who had been doing difficult work for a long time and had made a quiet peace with the weight of it. She was carrying 2 cups of something hot and aromatic that Aura did not recognize. She held one out. Coffee, she said in careful mid-Vorath. We thought you might appreciate something warm after the transit. It's one of ours, she smiled. The same kind of small, genuine smile that Lieutenant Commander Ase had worn on the bridge of the Eternal Dominion. The smile of a species that had apparently decided to face even historic moments with a quality that Aura was only beginning to understand was not naivety but a very specific kind of hard-won steadiness. We've been looking forward to this, Ray said. 63 years is a long time to wait for a conversation. Aura took the cup. She looked past the ambassador through the viewport at the far end of the docking corridor, and there it was, Earth visible even at this distance, a small blue point of light in the dark between stars, small, quiet, completely serenely unbothered. She thought about the founding photograph, the people in the windowless room, the linguists who decoded a language they were never supposed to know, the engineers who hid weapons inside satellites patiently for 60 years and told nobody, the mathematician in some quiet office who had calculated the coordinates of this exact station, this exact empty point of space, on the assumption that one day there would be a Meeting here worth calculating for, she thought about what it meant to look at a dangerous galaxy and respond not with conquest, not with fear, but with 63 years of patient, invisible, almost incomprehensible preparation, and then, at the end of it, to send someone to a neutral station with a warm drink and an open question. She wrapped both hands around the cup. It was warm. I have great many questions, she said. Ambassador Ray settled into the chair across from her with the ease of someone who had time. So do we, she said. We've been curious about you for a very long time. Somewhere in the archives of the Eternal Throne, the Imperial chronicler was completing the final entry for the Day of Reckoning. The language was formal, as it always was, precise, measured, stripped of opinion. But at the very end, in the space reserved for the chronicler's own historical assessment, a single line was added that would be read and reread by Voreth historians for the next 1,000 years. It read, "Do not go to Saul. We're ready before we were born."